A courtroom filled with tension, lawyers arguing, a judge listening intently, and a little girl sitting silently next to her loyal dog. Then suddenly, a secret signal. Within seconds, the entire courtroom comes to a halt. The judge, stunned, stops everything. But why? What did the dog do? And how did a simple hand movement change everything? Stay with us until the end of this video, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people shuffled in their seats, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Lawyers flipped through their notes, the judge adjusted his glasses, and the jury sat upright, ready to listen. At the center of it all sat a little girl, no older than 10, her small hands clutching a leash. Attached to that leash was a golden retriever named Max, his soft fur shining under the bright courtroom lights. Unlike the others in the room, he wasn't focused on the case, the evidence, or the lawyers. His attention was solely on the little girl beside him. Emily sat stiffly in the witness chair, her feet barely touching the ground. She wore a simple blue dress, her blonde hair neatly tied back, but it was her eyes that told the real story. They were filled with something deeper than nervousness, something closer to fear. She had been called to testify, to speak about events no child should ever have to remember, let alone recount in front of a room full of strangers. But as she sat there, surrounded by people waiting for her words, she found that none would come. The judge, an older man with kind but serious eyes, leaned forward slightly. "Emily," he said gently, "do you feel ready to speak?" The girl's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She cast a quick glance at the other side of the courtroom, where the defendant sat with his lawyer. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, and that alone made her throat tighten. Her small fingers gripped the fabric of her dress, and Max, sensing the shift in her emotions, leaned in closer. A few moments passed. The defense attorney cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Your Honor, if the witness is unable to answer, perhaps we should—" But before he could finish his sentence, something happened. Emily's hand moved, just a small, almost imperceptible gesture. A subtle flick of her fingers, a signal so quick that most in the room would have missed it entirely. But Max didn't. The golden retriever, who had been lying calmly at her feet, suddenly stiffened. His ears perked up, his body tensed, and within seconds he stood up. His golden fur bristled slightly as he positioned himself directly in front of Emily, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert. His eyes locked onto the defendant, his head slightly lowered as if ready to act. A ripple of confusion spread across the courtroom. The defense attorney blinked. The jury exchanged glances. Even the judge furrowed his brow. "What just happened?" one of the courtroom officers whispered. Emily said nothing, but her hand remained on Max's back. The dog wasn't barking, wasn't growling. He was simply standing there, unwavering, a silent barrier between the little girl and the man across the room. The judge sat up straighter. "Emily," he said again, his voice calm but firm, "was that a signal?" For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, she moved her head, just the slightest nod. The realization settled over the room like a thick fog. Max hadn't reacted randomly. He hadn't been startled or distracted. He had seen that tiny practiced movement from Emily and immediately understood what it meant. The defendant shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening on the table in front of him. The room, once filled with quiet chatter, had fallen into complete silence. The judge glanced at the prosecution. "Does this dog have any special training?" A woman in a dark suit, The attorney representing Emily stood. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "Max is a trained emotional support and protection dog. He has been with Emily since, well, since the incident." The words hung in the air. The implication was clear. The judge nodded slowly, taking in the scene before him. "And what exactly does that signal mean?" Emily hesitated, then swallowed hard. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "It means I don't feel safe." A collective breath seemed to be drawn across the room. Max, still standing firm, hadn't moved a muscle. His eyes remained locked on the man across the courtroom, his quiet presence speaking louder than any testimony ever could. For the first time, the judge seemed to truly see what was happening. A little girl, too afraid to speak, had found a way to communicate through the one companion she trusted the most. And that companion, loyal, attentive, and utterly devoted, had responded in a way that no words ever could. The judge slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the desk before him. "We need to pause these proceedings," he declared. The defense attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor, I must object." But the judge raised a hand. "No," he said firmly. "This changes things." Emily exhaled softly, barely audible, as she clung to Max's fur. The golden retriever finally relaxed, his tail wagging ever so slightly as if to reassure her. She had spoken, maybe not with words, but in the only way she knew how. And for the first time, someone had listened. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Every person in the room seemed frozen in place, their eyes shifting between the little girl and her dog. The tension, thick and unspoken, was suddenly more real than ever before. Max remained standing, his body rigid, his golden fur bristling ever so slightly, as his sharp eyes remained locked onto the man across the room. His stance wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't passive either. It was a warning, clear, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Emily still hadn't spoken more than a few words, but her actions had spoken volumes. Her fingers lightly stroked Max's back, as if drawing comfort from the familiar warmth of his fur. She hadn't expected him to react so strongly, but deep down she wasn't surprised. He always knew. He always understood her in ways no one else did. The judge looked down at his notes, then back up at Emily. His face was calm, but his mind was racing. He had been on the bench for years, had seen hundreds of cases, but never had he witnessed anything quite like this. A child too afraid to speak, yet her protector had done the speaking for her. The defense attorney cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, this is highly unusual. A dog's reaction cannot be considered legal evidence." But the judge held up a hand. "Unusual, yes. Irrelevant. I'm not so sure." A few murmurs spread through the jury box. The jurors, who had been sitting in quiet observation, now leaned in closer, watching with renewed interest. They had seen the fear in Emily's eyes, the tension in her small shoulders, and now they had seen her dog respond as if her very life depended on it. The prosecutor stood, her voice measured. "Your Honor, Max is not just a pet. He's a trained emotional support and protection dog. That reaction wasn't random. It was intentional." The defense attorney scoffed. "He's a dog. He doesn't understand legal matters." The prosecutor turned to Emily, her tone gentler now. "Emily, can you tell us what Max was trained to do when you gave that signal?" The little girl hesitated, her fingers tightening around Max's fur. Her voice was soft, but every word carried weight. He's trained to protect me when I feel scared, when I don't feel safe." A hush fell over the room. Those words alone were more powerful than any long-winded testimony. The judge observed Emily carefully, then turned to the prosecution. Has Max reacted this way before? The attorney nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Emily's therapist has documented his behavior. He reacts specifically when he senses distress or danger. The signal she gave wasn't accidental. It was intentional. And Max's response was exactly what he was trained to do. The judge's gaze flickered toward the defendant. The man sat stiffly, his hands clasped together. His expression was unreadable, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. The defense lawyer shifted uncomfortably. With all due respect, Your Honor, we cannot allow a child's fear and a dog's instincts to dictate the outcome of a trial. The judge leaned back in his chair. And yet, you expect us to disregard an undeniable, instinctual reaction from an animal whose sole purpose is to protect his owner? He shook his head. That would be a mistake. Emily sat still, watching as the adults debated around her. But Max never wavered. He remained standing, positioned between her and the defendant, his protective presence an unspoken statement of its own. The judge turned to Emily once more, his expression softening. Emily, do you trust Max? For the first time, she didn't hesitate. Yes. Has Max ever been wrong when he's reacted this way? She shook her head. No. The simplicity of her answer was enough to make even the most skeptical people in the room reconsider. Dogs didn't lie. They didn't manipulate. They reacted based on what they sensed. And if Max had sensed something wrong, the judge wasn't about to ignore that. A few members of the jury exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. It was one thing to hear a child's testimony. It was another to see a trained animal instinctively respond to her emotions in real time. It was undeniable proof that something was off, something that words alone might not have been able to express. The judge exhaled deeply and tapped his fingers against the desk. This court does not take lightly the importance of credible testimony, but we also do not ignore the significance of behavioral evidence, especially from a trained support animal. He turned to the prosecutor. I would like to hear more about Max's training and his history with Emily. The defense attorney opened his mouth to object again, but one glance at the judge's face made it clear. The argument was no longer in his favor. This was no longer just a case of a child's word against an adult's. This was a moment where the undeniable bond between a girl and her dog had changed everything. Max finally sat back down, but he remained alert. Emily took a deep breath, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. The judge took a deep breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the wooden bench before him. The weight of the moment was unmistakable. The energy in the courtroom had shifted entirely, and there was no ignoring it. A trained dog reacting to a child's distress wasn't something he could brush aside. If anything, it was a statement louder than words. The defense attorney, clearly unsettled by the turn of events, straightened his tie and cleared his throat. Your Honor, with all due respect, we cannot allow this proceeding to be derailed by the instincts of a dog. This is a courtroom, not a training facility for animals. The judge looked at him, his expression unreadable. And yet this dog, trained specifically to recognize fear and danger, reacted in a way that indicates something very real is happening here. Are you suggesting we ignore that entirely? The defense attorney hesitated, glancing at the jury. Some of them were nodding slightly, clearly moved by what had just unfolded. He knew this wasn't going in his favor. I'm simply stating that emotional responses, whether from a child or an animal, should not be taken as evidence. The prosecutor stepped forward before the judge could respond. Your Honor, the child may be too afraid to speak, but her body language and the reaction of her trained support animal say more than words ever could. Max is not an untrained pet reacting randomly. He's been specifically trained to detect fear, anxiety, and danger. His reaction is not just an emotional response, it's evidence of a deeper truth. The judge leaned back in his chair, glancing at Emily. The little girl remained quiet, her hands still resting on Max's fur. She wasn't shaking as much now, though. It was clear that just having Max there gave her strength. The judge turned his attention back to the defense attorney. Would you agree that witness testimony is often about more than just words? That body language, tone, and nonverbal cues all contribute to determining the credibility of a statement? The defense attorney hesitated. Well, yes, but... And would you agree that trained professionals, such as behavioral analysts and therapists, often use these cues to determine truthfulness and emotional state? Yes, the judge nodded. Then explain to me why a trained support dog, reacting exactly as he had been conditioned to in distressing situations, should not be considered as a credible response to this child's fear? Silence. The defense attorney had no good argument. The jury members watched closely, their eyes flickering between Emily, Max, and the judge. It was clear where this was going. The judge exhaled slowly. This court cannot and will not dismiss a response that may very well be the strongest piece of testimony we have. Emily may be too afraid to verbalize her experience, but Max's reaction is an extension of her fear, a mirror of what she is unable to say out loud. That cannot be ignored. A small gasp was heard somewhere in the audience. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his posture stiffer than before. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Do you have evidence of Max's training and history? The prosecutor nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We have records from his trainers and Emily's therapist, all confirming that he has been conditioned to react this way when she feels unsafe. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench, thinking. Then finally he nodded. Proceed. The defense attorney ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. He had lost this battle. The courtroom, once a place where his client had the advantage, was now something entirely different. The air had shifted, and it was clear the jury was no longer just seeing this as another case. They were seeing the truth unfold before them, not through statements or arguments, but through the unbreakable bond between a girl and her dog. Emily sat still, her fingers lightly brushing Max's fur. For the first time since she had entered that room, she felt like she was being heard, without even needing to speak. The tension in the courtroom was almost tangible. No one spoke for a moment as the weight of the judge's words settled over everyone. Emily sat quietly, her fingers still curled into Max's fur, her small body pressed slightly against his for comfort. The golden retriever had not moved from his spot, still positioned protectively between her and the defendant. His ears twitched, his eyes alert, as if he knew the significance of what was happening. The judge turned to the prosecution. Please proceed with presenting the evidence regarding Max's training and history. The prosecutor stepped forward, opening a folder and pulling out a document. Your Honor, this is a certified statement from Max's trainer, who worked with him for over a year before he was placed with Emily. His training specialized in emotional support, protection, and recognizing distress signals specific to his owner. She paused and then continued. In addition, We have documented reports from Emily's therapist confirming that Max has been trained to respond immediately when she feels unsafe. His reaction today is not random. It's exactly what he was conditioned to do in moments of distress. The judge took the document and reviewed it carefully. He nodded slightly, clearly absorbing the importance of what was in front of him. The defense attorney, however, wasn't ready to give up just yet. He stood up, his voice calm but insistent. "Your Honor, I understand the emotional weight of this moment, but a dog's reaction should not dictate the course of this trial. There is no way to determine whether this was an instinctive response, a trained behavior, or simply a coincidence. The law requires evidence, not emotions." The prosecutor turned to face him, her expression composed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is evidence. Behavioral responses are used in court all the time. Body language, expert testimony, even silence can be interpreted. Max's reaction isn't just emotion. It's a direct, trained response to Emily's distress. If we ignore this, we ignore the strongest testimony she has." The judge folded his hands together, deep in thought. The jury sat still, their expressions serious as they watched the scene unfold. They had seen the fear in Emily's eyes, the way her entire body tensed when she first sat down. More importantly, they had seen Max's reaction, how immediate it was, how unwavering. That wasn't something they could forget. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady. "I believe there is enough evidence to continue this discussion further. The court cannot disregard the behavior of a trained support animal that has been conditioned to recognize fear and respond accordingly." He turned to Emily, his expression softening. "Emily, I know this is difficult, but do you feel safe enough to continue?" Emily hesitated, her grip on Max tightening. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, Max gently nudged her hand with his nose. She looked down at him, his warm brown eyes staring back at her with unwavering trust. She took a deep breath and gave the smallest nod. "Yes," she whispered. The room was silent for a moment. It was a small word, but it carried a powerful meaning. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his face tight with tension. He had been confident when this trial began, believing that a child's fear wouldn't be enough to stand against him. But now he was seeing something he hadn't anticipated, the undeniable presence of truth, shown not through accusations, but through something as pure and honest as a dog's loyalty. Max remained steady, his protective nature unwavering. He had been by Emily's side through the worst moments of her life, and now he was here for this one too. The love and trust between them were impossible to ignore. The prosecutor took a step forward. "Your Honor, we request to bring in additional expert testimony regarding Max's training and his role as Emily's support animal. His reaction today is a key piece of this case, and we believe further clarification from professionals will reinforce what we have already seen." The judge nodded. "Request granted. We will hear from the experts." The defense attorney clenched his jaw but said nothing. He knew he was losing ground fast. The jury had seen too much. There was no dismissing the bond between Emily and Max. It was real, undeniable, and most importantly, it told the truth. Emily let out a small breath, her body slightly relaxing against Max's side. She had come into this courtroom terrified, unable to find her voice. But now she understood something she hadn't before. She didn't have to speak alone. Max had spoken for her in the only way he knew how. And for the first time, the world was listening. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share. And if you want more inspiring pet stories, make sure to subscribe.